Welcome to this Unreal Editor tips and shortcuts video. I'm a technical artist in the game industry and have found these to save quite a bit of time over the years. I picked these up from others in the industry, Epic's own presentations, as well as my own tinkering. I hope it's helpful to have them all in one place, so let's check them out. There are a ton of editor preferences you can change, but here are a few that I found myself using pretty much with every project. This open location is really nice to change depending on your monitor setup, but if you want to keep everything in the main window, you can do the option that I use here. The default goes to a new window, but there are a few different options in here. Next one is the autosave option. By default this is on, and some people find it handy, but the timing that it can go off and some of the slowdown that you'll see with it, especially with bigger maps or bigger assets, can be really aggravating. There's even a chance it could crash and corrupt some files, so I find it's better to turn it off. A better alternative I find is the save all command up in the file option. You can just get used to hitting Ctrl-Shift-S as well. That'll save everything if you're in the editor window, and if you're in the content browser it'll just save those assets. And the next one is the comment bubble default color. The default is bright white, which can be pretty annoying and distracting. So I find turning this down to a darker, even just a dark gray is great. You can do whatever you want for the default and then change it afterwards. That does not apply to the default color of the comment bubbles in the material editor, unfortunately. Not sure why, but it's still worth setting here. This next one is this frame rate and memory setting. Makes it so it's always visible up at the top of the bar. It's really nice because you don't have to use the in-window frame rate counter if that's all you want to see. It lets you keep the real-time toggle off too. The next one's in project settings, but it is definitely an editor preference. That's the editor startup map. This is great because you can keep it blank if you want a really quick startup, or you can select a specific map that you're constantly working in. It's just good to avoid setting this to any map that's particularly heavy or large, because it will slow down your editor startup time. A little extra here regarding loading maps. This recent levels menu is really handy, and I see a lot of people overlook it. It's a nice quick way to jump between frequently used and recently used maps. You can also set your own favorite levels to kind of do the same thing. This next set of tips is about searching and all the search options in this editor, and there are a lot. Normally you could browse through your project folders and manually check through stuff, that's fine. But it gets old, especially as your project gets bigger and bigger. So this first one here is one of my favorites, and that is the Control-P project search. You can hit Control-P from pretty much anywhere in the editor, and we'll open up this new window, letting you either type in the name of an asset you want to look for, or use these filters that are up top. One of the nice things about typing in the name of what you want to search for is you don't have to type in the exact name. And in fact, most of the time, it's better if you don't. Type in the first 2 or 3 letters of the first 2 or 3 words, and it should be all you need. You can also not type in anything and purely browse by a class type. You just want to look at materials or skeletal meshes. To add these asset type filters, just hit the 3-line drop down in the top left and then select whichever you want. This first set in the list are the more common kind of primary assets, but then in the type filters a little further down you can add a lot of the child classes and secondary classes, or add the entire set by checking the box on the left. You can use those same search methods and filters in almost any menu in the editor. And again, you pretty much never need to type out the search that you're looking for word, letter for letter. Best to do just a few letters of each word. You probably noticed that your content browser doesn't have all these search filters like mine does. These work just like that Control-P filter list, where you just add them with the 3-line drop down and they'll stay put in the content browser. The nice thing with these here is it will show you every asset type of that filter with whatever folders that you have selected in the browser, including any child folders. And if you ever want to clear out all of those filters just to get rid of them in one shot, the Reset Filters option will do that. One of the more hidden search options in the editor is, particularly with the content browser, is you can search by asset stats. You can see those stats and what will be searchable if you mouse over any static mesh, skeletal mesh, audio, anything. But you can also see them pretty quickly if you switch to the column view. Now let's look at some blueprint shortcuts and hotkeys. These first two apply to almost anything, but are especially useful with blueprints. This is the Control B, it's a browse to hotkey. You just select anything on your map, hit Control B, and it'll jump right to it in the content browser. The next one is Control E, and that will edit whatever you have selected. If it's a blueprint, of course it'll open the blueprint for editing. If it's a mesh, it'll go to the mesh settings. If it's a level instance, however, it will just edit in place in the world. This next one's a very minor shortcut, but it does save quite a bit of time in the long run. That is Control or Alt dragging a variable out into a blueprint. Instead of having to drag it out, then select Get or Set, this is just one less click. This is another fairly minor one, but instead of manually creating every input and output variable, you can simply drag a pin over those input and output nodes, and it will create it on the spot. This next one's great for when you need to delete a node but don't want to have to rewire everything in between. Normally you'd select a node, delete it, reconnect the execution pin. You can actually just select whatever nodes you want to remove and then Shift Delete, and it will reconnect things in between. Unfortunately, this is another one that only works in blueprints, not in the material graph. Here's another single-click savings, but one that ends up saving a ton of time and clicks over years of editor use. Instead of having to hit the compile and save button for every blueprint update you do, you can set in these 3-dot menu to always save every time you compile. So then it's just one click and it'll take care of both. Materials will actually do this by default, but somewhat reversed order, where if you hit the save button in there, it also compiles with it. Next up are child blueprints. These are a great saving both in time and in bug frustration down the road. A lot of times you might be tempted to make edits to a blueprint within the world, and if it's top level changes, any exposed parameters, that's alright. But if you're having to go into deeper level components and settings, you should really make a child blueprint and do those changes there. Also great to use as like a preset or a prefab. You can compile things together but tier their functionality, where a parent holds most of the data and the children hold the very specific changes that you need. This next set is a bit of a mix, but mostly has to do with the main viewport and details panels. First up is the real-time toggle. By default, your viewport is running real-time as if it were a game being played, meaning that your graphics card and your power supply are constantly cooking, especially if there's a lot going on or if you have very high scalability set. You can see the frame rate and memory usage up with the top with that setting I mentioned earlier. But if you want to reduce a little fan noise from your computer, save a little money on the power consumption, just hit Control R, or in the 3-line menu, check the real-time toggle. This is usually a good mode to keep on to pretty much everything, like level blockout, full-on environment design. The only thing that this really doesn't work well with is VFX. All previews are frozen. Oh, and keep in mind that showing the stats within the viewport will automatically disable that real-time toggle and make it so you can't turn it back on unless you disable the stats. This next one's really simple, but I see a lot of people overlook it, and that is the reset option on almost any parameter. Little back arrow I'll let you reset to whatever the default is. Hotkeys are definitely worth a mention as well, so you can set one for almost any option within the editor. Some of the most useful that I find are some of the view modes. Save you time from having to dig through the menus to find like the distance field previews or certain nanite settings. These are really great to set if you have a free hotkey. Oh, and remember that anything that does have a hotkey set usually shows what that hotkey is to the right of it in whatever menu it exists in. It's kind of nice for learning some things you might otherwise overlook. Like some of the viewport camera mode views, the Alt-G HJK set will let you jump from the default perspective view to a kind of an ortho side, front, top view. These next ones are mostly about project organization. They're incredibly important, especially in the long run and with bigger teams. They can save you huge amounts of time and headaches. Keeping your folder structure and naming as clear and simple as you can makes a huge difference. But it's also important to make sure you don't go too deep and nest an endless amount of folders within each other. File naming and their prefix is also quite important. Try to decide on a standard that your entire team wants to use as early as possible and make sure everyone really sticks to it. A side note here, if you notice that I'm quickly collapsing and expanding folder sets in both the content browser and the outliner really quickly, that's with a shift click. With a normal click, it will just retain whatever expanded folders you had already, but a shift click will either collapse everything or expand everything, depending on which way you go. It's really nice if you don't want to have to scroll through a huge list of folders and other outliner content as your map grows. Speaking of the outliner, this is another good standard that you want to set again as early as possible with your team. Make sure everyone's alright and really enforce a certain folder structure. If everyone is just throwing things at the top level like all these demo child duplicates, it just turns into a massive list you have to scroll through and there's no way to collapse them. Organizing that afterward the fact is rather painful. One of the really useful tools to avoid that, however, is this make current option. You can set that on any folder in an outliner, and then any duplicated or new asset that you add to the map will automatically go into that folder. Right click in any folder name, saying make current will enable that, as well as turn it green to let you know it's on. You can just clear current later if you want to disable it or change it over to a different folder. The Move To option is another great one. You can right click any asset, move to any folder in the outliner. You can also quickly search any of those folders if you have too long of a list where you'd have to scroll through it. The next one I want to hit on real quick is the import settings. These change depending on what type of asset you're working with, but here are a few of the most important ones with static meshes that I've constantly run into. The default with vertex color used to be ignore, but it's now set to replace, which is really great with nanite because you can get a lot of definition in all the vert color with all the higher definition meshes there, but just keep in mind that that has changed. Under the collision section, this is another one that's changed recently where it used to just be a checkbox that would auto-generate any missing collision, but now it's this fallback collision type. In either case, though, I recommend disabling it because the collision it makes can be bad, to say the least, sometimes just unhelpful. But also it's a kind of a bad habit to form because a lot of times you either don't want any collision with like smaller decorative assets or things in the distance, or it can even cause some serious bugs where a mesh is either too big or maybe there's a bugged out vertex where this auto collision will create something that can span an entire level and it'll be very buggy and difficult to see. Those are always fun to track down. In a lot of the cases you can create a UCX collision beforehand in whatever your 3D editor is, but in the rest of the cases a simple cube or capsule will work just fine. You can create that within the mesh settings itself. Whether you want to enable nanite or not is up to you and your project. But the big one worth mentioning here, just under it, is the generate light map UVs. That used to be on by default. Thankfully it is not anymore. So you definitely want that off with most nanite, especially with lumen, because you're not going to be baking UVs, and it just adds it's 10 to 30% more to your mesh size and memory, so it's just a waste. Same goes for extra UV channels. Try to strip those down, because every one you have just adds a multiplier to that extra cost that really is completely unnecessary. Eats up your memory and disk size for no use. So next two are a little more of a personal preference, but can definitely save on your project organization. I almost always disable these import materials and import texture options. If you don't, you'll find you'll end up with a lot of duplicated materials and textures within your project that you just don't need. The nice thing too is once you have all of these set, the editor remembers those settings, so every time you're re-importing something, it keeps it all there, or importing something new. This last tip is pretty useful in most things in life, but especially in Unreal, and that's to just focus. There's so much you can do within the engine and the editor. There's so many systems to build, environments to block out, VFX to create, just on and on. Just try your best to stay focused on one or two tasks at a time. Get those feeling really good before you move on to something else. That said, you do want to take note of any other good ideas that come to mind, anything that tries to pull you away. There's a lot of great things that can hit you when you're not really expecting it, but it also can fade just as quickly if you don't take a note of it. There's some nice editor options for taking notes though, so you can do it right wherever you're working. Make a comment box in a blueprint that you're currently in, or a material editor. Just leave yourself notes. Remind yourself of bugs that you might have come across that relate to another system or whatever. Just keep notes everywhere. Keep notes and focus. That is it for this round though. Thanks again for watching, and see you next time.